The studio lights blazed as Michelle Obama called Donald Trump a pathetic loser on live TV. Her words sharp. The audience roaring. Karoline Leavitt, a young press secretary, sat quietly in CNN's waiting room, dismissed as too inexperienced by whispering stagehands. No one knew her father had shaped Trump's policies decades ago. Why would a former First Lady's words spark a fire in someone so underestimated? Before we dive into today's story, if you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. You're also welcome to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Every piece of feedback is truly valuable in helping Crossfire Justice improve. Thank you so much for always being with us. And now, let's jump into this thrilling and unexpected story together. The studio of The View buzzed with energy, its bright lights casting a warm glow over the polished stage. The audience clapped wildly as Michelle Obama strode out, her smile wide and effortless, exuding the kind of confidence that filled a room. She settled into her seat, her posture relaxed, and began speaking with a tone that was both measured and sharp. "Donald Trump," she said, pausing for effect, "is a pathetic loser. His deportation policies are cruel. And don't get me started on that marriage to Melania." The crowd erupted in laughter, some clapping, others nodding in agreement. Her words carried the weight of someone who knew her voice mattered, each syllable landing like a carefully aimed dart across town. In a dimly lit waiting room at CNN's New York studio, Karoline Leavitt sat alone on a stiff leather couch. Her hands rested on a neat stack of papers, her fingers gripping the edges just a little too tightly. At 27, she was the youngest press secretary in White House history, a fact that seemed to invite skepticism from everyone around her. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her navy blazer was crisp but unremarkable. To the casual observer, she looked like any other junior staffer, perhaps out of her depth in the high-stakes world of political media. A stagehand passing by glanced at her, then leaned toward a colleague, his voice low but not low enough. "Her taking on Michelle Obama. Good luck with that." The words stung, but Karoline didn't flinch. Her blue eyes, sharp and unyielding, stayed fixed on the television screen mounted on the wall. On the screen, Michelle continued, her voice rising with conviction. "Trump's policies tear families apart," she said, her hands gesturing to emphasize the point. "It's not just bad leadership, it's heartless." The audience cheered again, their applause drowning out the faint hum of the studio's air conditioning. Karoline's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of the moment. The way Michelle's words weren't just a critique but a public dismissal of everything Karoline's team stood for. The stagehand's comment echoed in her mind, mingling with the laughter from the television. She wasn't just being underestimated, she was being written off entirely. The waiting room was quiet except for the soft buzz of the television and the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside. A makeup artist poked her head in, offering a quick touch-up, but Karoline waved her off with a polite smile. She didn't need powder or gloss, she needed focus. The papers in her lap were her armor, filled with notes she'd spent hours preparing data on economic growth, border security stats, and a few carefully chosen quotes. She'd always believed in the power of facts, a lesson her father had drilled into her during long evenings at their kitchen table in New Hampshire. Truth doesn't need a loud voice, he'd said. It just needs someone to carry it. But carrying the truth in a world that loved spectacle was no small task. Karoline glanced at the clock on the wall. In 20 minutes, she'd be live on CNN, facing a seasoned anchor and a national audience. The stagehand's whisper wasn't the first slight she'd endured, nor would it be the last. She'd heard it all before too young, too inexperienced. Just a Trump loyalist riding the coattails of a controversial administration. Yet here she was, about to step into the ring with one of the most revered figures in American politics. The television cut to a commercial break, and the room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Karoline's fingers brushed against a small silver pen in her pocket, a gift from her father engraved with the word courage. She didn't take it out, but the cool metal against her fingertips grounded her. Outside, the stagehand laughed again, his voice carrying through the thin walls. The audience's cheers from the view still lingered in her ears, each one a reminder of the mountain she was about to climb. Michelle Obama's words had lit a fuse, and Karoline could feel the heat of it in her chest. She wasn't here to argue for the sake of arguing. She was here to set something right. The door to the studio creaked open, and a producer's voice called her name. The lights were waiting, and so was the world. The CNN waiting room was a small, sterile space, its walls lined with posters of past broadcasts and a single television flickering in the corner. Karoline Leavitt sat on a gray chair, her posture straight but not rigid, her hands resting on a manila folder filled with carefully annotated documents. She wore a simple navy dress, professional but understated, the kind that didn't scream for attention. Her fingers, though, betrayed a quiet tension, tracing the edges of a silver pen tucked in her pocket. The pen was engraved with a single word, Dad. It was a gift from her father, a man who'd spent years advising politicians behind closed doors, teaching her that truth was a weapon best wielded with precision. Don't argue to win, he'd told her once, his voice steady over a crackling phone line. Let the facts do the talking. Those words echoed in her mind now, grounding her as the weight of the moment pressed down. On the television, a replay of Michelle Obama's segment on The View looped, her voice sharp and confident as she dismantled Trump's legacy. He's a man who thrives on division, she said. Her words met with nods and applause from the studio audience. Social media was already ablaze, posts flooding in with hashtags like Queen Michelle and Truth Teller. Karoline's phone, resting face down on the chair beside her, buzzed faintly, but she didn't check it. She knew what she'd find: tweets praising Michelle, dismissing Trump's team as out of touch, and likely, somewhere in the mix, her own name dragged through the mud. At 27, she was used to being underestimated, her youth and quiet demeanor mistaken for inexperience. But today, that misjudgment felt heavier, like a stone lodged in her chest. A stagehand crossed the room, his sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floor. He carried a clipboard and a coffee cup, his eyes flicking toward Karoline before he leaned toward another crew member near the door. She's too young for this, he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Probably just a White House prop. You know, one of those Trump cheerleaders. The other crew member chuckled, a low, dismissive sound, and turned away. Karoline's fingers paused on the pen, her breath catching for a moment. She could feel the familiar sting of being written off, the way people looked at her and saw only a young woman who must have lucked into her role. But she didn't look up. She didn't need to. Her father's voice was there again, calm and steady. Let them underestimate you. It's their mistake. Across the room, an older woman sat quietly, her hands folded over a worn leather purse. She was a guest waiting for another segment, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, her eyes sharp despite the lines etched around them. She'd been watching Karoline since she entered, noticing the way the young woman's shoulders stayed square even as the stagehands whispered. When the crew member's comment landed, the woman's lips pressed into a thin line, and she gave Karoline a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Karoline's grip on the pen loosen slightly. Someone had seen her, really seen her, and that tiny gesture felt like a tether to the world outside, the storm brewing in her mind. Karoline opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages she'd spent hours preparing. There were charts on job growth, excerpts from border security reports, and a few handwritten notes in the margins, reminders to stay calm, to stick to the facts. She'd always been meticulous, a habit born from years of watching her father navigate the murky waters of political strategy. He'd been a quiet force, never seeking the spotlight. But his work had shaped policies that affected millions. Karoline had inherited that quiet determination. Though she'd learned early that the world didn't always reward it. Not yet. At least, she closed the folder and tucked it under her arm. Her movements deliberate. The television switched to a commercial, the sudden silence in the room amplifying the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The stagehand returned, this time with a headset looped around his neck. He glanced at Karoline, his expression a mix of pity and skepticism. "You're up in 10, he said, his tone flat. "Hope you're ready for the big leagues." Karoline met his gaze, her eyes steady, and nodded once. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence was answer enough. But inside, her heart was racing, not with fear, but with something fiercer, a resolve that had been building since she first heard Michelle's words. The world might see her as too young, too small, too insignificant to challenge a titan like Michelle Obama, but they didn't know her. Not yet. She stood, smoothing her dress, and slipped the pen back into her pocket. The older woman across the room watched her rise, her nod turning into a faint smile, as if she could sense the fire beneath Karoline's calm exterior. The door to the studio loomed ahead, a rectangle of bright light spilling into the dim waiting room. Karoline took a deep breath, the air cool against her lips, and stepped forward. The stage was waiting, and so was her moment. She wasn't here to shout or to prove herself to the stagehands. She was here to let the truth stand tall, and it was almost time. The CNN studio was a cavern of light and sound, its sleek black stage illuminated by harsh spotlights that made the air feel warmer than it was. Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the platform, her low heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She wore the same navy dress from the waiting room, its simplicity a stark contrast to the high-gloss energy of the set. The audience, a mix of in-studio guests and millions watching online, waited in a hush as she took her seat across from the anchor. A veteran journalist named David Harper. His silver hair and practiced smile gave him an air of authority, but his eyes held a glint of skepticism as he adjusted his notes. Karoline's folder rested on the table before her, its edges worn from her nervous handling. She sat straight, her hands folded, her face calm but her heart thudding like a drum in her chest. Harper leaned forward, his voice smooth and measured. "Ms. Leavitt, we've all seen Michelle Obama's comments on The View. She called President Trump a failure, his policies cruel. As his press secretary, how do you respond?" The question was a trap, laced with the assumption that she'd fumble under the weight of Michelle's stature. Karoline took a slow breath, her fingers brushing the silver pen in her pocket. The word, Dad, a silent anchor. "Mrs. Obama called the president a failure," she began, her voice steady, each word deliberate. "But let's look at the numbers. Under his administration, unemployment dropped to historic lows, 3.5% before the pandemic. Small businesses grew by 1 million. And on immigration, border apprehensions decreased by 83% in key sectors." The facts rolled off her tongue, sharp and unyielding, like stones dropped into still water. The studio audience stirred, a few whispers breaking the silence. Harper raised an eyebrow, his smile tightening. "Those are bold claims," he said, leaning back. "But Michelle Obama isn't just anyone. She's a former First Lady, a global icon. Do you really think you're qualified to challenge her?" The question landed like a jab, and the audience's murmurs grew louder. Online, social media lit up, posts calling Karoline arrogant and out of her depth gaining traction. She felt the sting, the familiar ache of being dismissed. But her father's voice echoed in her mind. Truth doesn't need permission, she smiled. A small, controlled curve of her lips, but her blue eyes were ice. Qualifications aren't about titles. Mr. Harper, she said. They're about facts, and the facts don't care who's speaking them. A stagehand behind the cameras, a lanky man with a headset, shook his head, his lips curling in a smirk. He'd been one of the skeptics in the waiting room, and now he seemed almost amused, as if watching a child try to lift a weight too heavy for her. But his coworker, a younger woman operating a soundboard, glanced at Karoline with a flicker of curiosity, her fingers pausing on the controls. The studio lights felt hotter now, the air thick with expectation. Karoline opened her folder, pulling out a single sheet of paper. Let's talk about the deportation policies Mrs. Obama called cruel. She continued. In 2019, our administration prioritized criminal offenders for removal. 68% of deportations targeted felons. That's not heartless. That's focused. Her voice didn't waver. But inside, she felt the strain of holding her ground against a tide of doubt. Harper shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping the desk. You're sidestepping the human cost, he said, his tone sharper now. Mrs. Obama spoke about families torn apart. Are you saying she's wrong? The audience leaned in, sensing a clash. Karoline's jaw tightened. But she didn't take the bait. She thought of her father, who'd spent years navigating rooms like this, never raising his voice but always leaving with the last word. I'm saying the story isn't that simple, she replied. Every policy has trade-offs. Mrs. Obama knows that better than most. The words hung in the air, a subtle jab that made Harper pause. The stagehand's smirk faltered, and the soundboard operator's eyes widened slightly, her hands still on the controls, online. The reaction was immediate. Some viewers praised Karoline's composure, but others doubled down, calling her cold and robotic. A tweet with thousands of likes read, "Who does this kid think she is?" Going after Michelle. Karoline couldn't see the posts, but she felt the invisible weight of them, the world's judgment pressing against her. She leaned forward, her voice gaining a quiet intensity. I'm not here to attack anyone, she said, looking directly into the camera. I'm here to set the record straight, and I'm not done yet. The camera zoomed in, capturing the steel in her eyes, the faintest tremble in her hands. The studio was silent for a heartbeat, the tension so thick it seemed to hum. The stagehand behind the camera shifted his weight, his smirk gone now, replaced by a look of unease. The soundboard operator was watching Karoline closely, her expression unreadable but her hands no longer still. Harper cleared his throat, glancing at his notes as if searching for a way to regain control. The audience, both in the studio and online, was divided, their voices a cacophony of support and scorn. Karoline sat back, her folder still open, her pen still in her pocket. She'd thrown the first punch, and it had landed. But the fight was far from over. The lights burned brighter, the cameras kept rolling, and somewhere in the distance, a storm was gathering strength. The CNN studio pulsed with an electric tension, its sleek black stage a stark backdrop to the unfolding drama. Karoline Leavitt sat under the unforgiving glare of the spotlights, her navy dress absorbing the heat as she faced David Harper, the anchor whose practiced calm was beginning to fray. The audience, both in the studio and streaming online, leaned into the moment, their murmurs a low hum beneath the hum of the cameras. Karoline's folder lay open on the table, its pages fanned slightly, revealing handwritten notes and highlighted statistics. Her hands, steady despite the storm inside her, rested lightly on a single sheet of paper, an old memo, its edges yellowed, tucked between the crisp printouts. She'd held her ground so far, countering Harper's pointed questions with facts. But the weight of Michelle Obama's name still hung over the room like a shadow. Harper leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he sensed an opportunity to regain control. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice smooth but edged with challenge. "You've thrown out a lot of numbers. But let's be real. You're a young press secretary, barely out of your 20s, going up against a former First Lady. Why should anyone take your critique of her seriously?" The question was a blade, meant to cut deep, and the audience stirred, some nodding in agreement. Social media was relentless, with posts calling Karoline overconfident and naive racking up likes, the stagehand from earlier, still lingering behind a camera, smirked again, his arms crossed as if watching a predictable defeat. But Karoline didn't flinch. She thought of her father, his quiet strength, and the pen in her pocket that carried his legacy. She reached for the memo, her fingers brushing its worn surface, and her voice softened, carrying a weight that silenced the room. "My father worked with President Trump 20 years ago," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "He was a senior advisor on economic policy, one of the architects of the tax reforms that lifted millions. He taught me that truth isn't about who speaks loudest, it's about what holds up." The studio went still, the audience caught off guard by the revelation. Harper's smile faltered, his fingers pausing on his notes. Karoline's father, Robert Leavitt, wasn't a household name, but to those in the know, he was a legend. A man who shaped policy from the shadows, never seeking the spotlight. The stagehand's smirk vanished, his eyes widening as he exchanged a glance with the soundboard operator, who was now leaning forward, her hands frozen on the controls. Harper recovered quickly, his voice sharp. "You're asking us to believe you have a personal connection to the president. That's a convenient story, Ms. Karoline Leavitt." The accusation hung in the air, a dare for her to falter. Online, skeptics pounced, tweeting she's making it up to sound important. But Karoline didn't take the bait. She slid the memo across the table, its faded letterhead bearing the seal of a long-ago campaign. "This is a memo my father wrote in 2003. She said, it's not about me. It's about the work. And that work continues." She pivoted seamlessly, her voice steady. "Mrs. Obama criticized our deportation policies. Fine. But in 2019, 68% of deportations targeted criminals, drug traffickers, violent offenders. That's not cruelty. That's justice." The numbers were precise, unassailable, and they landed like a quiet thunderclap. The audience murmured, some in surprise, others in doubt. A woman in the front row, her glasses perched low on her nose, scribbled something in a notebook, her expression shifting from skepticism to curiosity. The soundboard operator's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Online, a tweet from a political blogger went viral. "Karoline Leavitt isn't just a press secretary. She's got roots in this game." The stagehand, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted his weight, his arms uncrossing. Karoline's revelation had cracked the narrative that she was just a young upstart. But Harper wasn't ready to yield. "Numbers are one thing," he said, his tone icy. "But you're sidestepping the human story." Mrs. Obama spoke from the heart. "Can you match that?" Karoline's chest tightened, not from fear but from the weight of carrying her father's legacy into a fight that felt bigger than herself. She thought of the evening she'd spent as a teenager, listening to him dissect policy over dinner, his voice calm but fierce. "Truth is your shield," he'd said. She looked at Harper, then at the camera, her blue eyes unwavering. "I'm not here to match anyone's story," she said. "I'm here to tell the one that's been ignored. And there's more to it than you think." The words were a promise, a hint of something deeper still to come. The audience leaned in, sensing a shift. But Harper pressed on, his questions growing sharper. The stage lights burned hotter, the cameras tighter, and Karoline's hand rested on the memo, its weight grounding her. The soundboard operator was watching closely now, her earlier indifference replaced by a quiet intensity. The woman in the front row stopped writing, her pen hovering over the page. Online, the tide was turning, with some viewers starting to question Michelle's narrative, though others doubled down, dismissing Karoline's story as a ploy. The studio felt like a pressure cooker, every word a spark that could ignite or extinguish. Karoline sat back, her folder still open, the memo a silent testament to her roots. She'd shown a piece of who she was, but not all of it, not yet. The cameras kept rolling, and the world was watching, waiting for her next move. The CNN studio was a crucible of light and tension, its polished stage reflecting the relentless glare of spotlights that seemed to tighten the air. Karoline Leavitt sat at the center of it all, her navy dress a quiet contrast to the frenetic energy swirling around her. Her folder lay open, the yellowed memo from her father now joined by a small stack of printed articles and a USB drive she'd kept hidden until now. Across from her, David Harper, the anchor, gripped his pen a little too tightly, his earlier confidence shaken by Karoline's steady stream of facts. The audience, both in the studio and streaming online, was a restless sea of whispers and scrolling comments, their reactions split between awe and outrage. Karoline's revelation about her father had shifted the room's dynamic, but the fight was far from over. She could feel the weight of millions watching, judging, and she knew one misstep could undo everything. Harper adjusted his tie, his voice regaining its edge. "Ms. Leavitt, you've made bold claims about your father's legacy and these policies," he said, his tone clipped. "But Mrs. Obama's point was about compassion, something numbers can't capture. Are you saying her perspective is irrelevant?" The question was a lifeline for him, a chance to steer the conversation back to safer ground. The audience leaned in, some nodding, others typing furiously on their phones. Social media was a battlefield, with hashtags like Michelle Forever clashing against a rising tide of Karoline claps back. Karoline's chest tightened, not from doubt but from the sheer effort of holding her ground. She thought of her father's pen in her pocket, its cool metal a reminder of why she was here, not to win a shouting match, but to let the truth breathe. She reached for the USB drive, her movements deliberate, and slid it toward the production assistant hovering nearby. "Play this," she said, her voice calm but firm. The assistant hesitated, glancing at Harper, who gave a reluctant nod. The studio's massive screen flickered, and a grainy video from 2011 appeared, a younger Michelle Obama, speaking at a community event. "We need strong immigration enforcement," she said in the clip, her voice clear. "It's about keeping our communities safe, and sometimes that means tough choices." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Harper's pen froze mid-air, his mouth parting slightly. The video was short, but its impact was seismic. Michelle had once endorsed a policy strikingly similar to the one she'd just condemned. The studio erupted in murmurs, and online, the reaction was instantaneous. Tweets exploded. "Did Karoline just checkmate Michelle, and this is unreal?" The hashtag Karoline claps back surged to the top of trending lists. In the studio, a freelance journalist named Sarah Coleman, who'd been sitting quietly in the third row, stood and began clapping, her hands cutting through the stunned silence. Her action was impulsive, a spark that caught the attention of others. A few audience members joined her, their applause tentative but growing. The stagehand from earlier, who'd smirked at Karoline's youth, stood frozen behind his camera, his arms limp at his sides. The soundboard operator, a young woman named Mia, was openly staring at Karoline now, her earlier skepticism replaced by something like admiration. Harper scrambled to regain control, his voice rising. "This is an old clip," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Context matters. Mrs. Obama's views have evolved," but Karoline was ready, her blue eyes locking onto his. "Context does matter," she said, her voice cutting through his deflection. "Mrs. Obama spoke about compassion today, but the truth doesn't pick sides. If we're going to talk about humanity, let's talk about the 68% of deportations in 2019 that targeted violent criminals. Let's talk about the families those policies protected." Her words were a blade, sharp and precise, and they landed with a force that made Harper lean back in his chair. The audience's applause grew louder. Sarah Coleman still standing, her claps a steady rhythm, but the moment of triumph was short-lived. The studio's secondary screen, displaying live social media feeds, flashed with a new message. "Anonymous but bold, Leavitt's just a Trump puppet, no backbone." The words glowed in stark white against the dark background, and a ripple of unease passed through the studio. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably, their applause faltering. Online, the comments sparked a new wave of attacks, with users piling on, "She's just reading a script and Trump's mouthpiece, nothing more." Karoline saw the message, her jaw tightening, but she didn't look away. The insult stung, not because it was new, but because it echoed the doubts she'd fought her entire career, doubts about her voice, her place, her worth. She thought of her father, his quiet evenings spent teaching her to stand tall, and her resolve hardened. She leaned forward, her gaze piercing the camera lens as if speaking directly to the world. "I'm not here to play anyone's game," she said, her voice low but resonant. "I'm here because the truth deserves a voice, no matter who carries it." The studio fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over the room like a heavy fog. Sarah Coleman's applause slowed, but her eyes stayed on Karoline, bright with respect. Mia, the soundboard operator, was nodding now, almost unconsciously, her hands still on the controls. Harper opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The audience was divided, some clapping, others whispering, and online, the battle raged on. Karoline's hands rested on her folder, the USB drive now back in her pocket beside her father's pen. She'd turned the tide, but the current was still strong, and she wasn't done fighting. The stage lights seemed to pulse, the cameras unyielding in their stare. Karoline sat back, her expression calm but her heart racing. She'd exposed a crack in Michelle's narrative, and the world had noticed, but the anonymous message lingered, a shadow over her victory. She knew she had one more card to play up, something bigger, something that could change everything. The studio clock ticked down, and the air felt charged, as if the next moment could shift the world. The CNN studio was a crucible of light and sound, its black stage a stark canvas for the drama unfolding beneath the relentless spotlights. Karoline Leavitt sat at the center, her navy dress absorbing the heat, her hands steady on the table where her open folder lay. The air was thick with anticipation, the audience's murmurs a low hum beneath the faint buzz of cameras. David Harper, the anchor, sat across from her, his silver hair catching the light, but his earlier confidence had eroded, replaced by a strained smile. The video of Michelle Obama's 2011 remarks had shifted the room's energy, and Karoline's calm, unyielding facts had kept it teetering on the edge. Her father's pen rested in her pocket, its engraved word, courage, a quiet pulse against her racing heart. She knew this was the moment, the one she'd been building toward, and there was no turning back. Harper leaned forward, his voice tight, trying to claw back control. "Mrs. Leavitt," "You've dug up an old clip and some numbers," he said, his tone sharp but unsteady. "But this feels personal. Are you attacking Mrs. Obama to score points for your boss?" The question was a jab, meant to paint her as petty, and the audience stirred. Some nodding, others whispering. Online, the social media storm raged on, with detractors calling her a Trump lackey while others hailed her as a truth-teller. The anonymous message from the last segment, "Leavitt's just a Trump puppet," still lingered on the studio's secondary screen. Its words a silent taunt. Karoline's jaw tightened, but her blue eyes stayed steady, locked on Harper. She thought of her father, his late-night lessons about standing firm, and the weight of his legacy steadied her. She reached into her folder, her fingers brushing past the yellowed memo to pull out a single document, its pages crisp and official, stamped with a government seal. "This isn't about scoring points," she said, her voice low but resonant, each word deliberate. "This is about the truth." She held up the document, a declassified report from the Department of Homeland Security, dated 2012. During the Obama administration, deportations averaged 400,000 per year, higher than any year under President Trump. In 2012 alone, 849 people were removed, many non-criminals. Mrs. Obama called our policies cruel, but her husband's record tells a different story. The numbers were cold, unyielding, and they landed like a hammer. The studio fell silent, the audience frozen, their breath held as if the air itself had paused. Harper's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering softly on the desk. His mouth opened, but no words came. The audience's silence broke into gasps, then murmurs, as the weight of Karoline's evidence settled over the room. The freelance journalist, Sarah Coleman, who'd stood to clap earlier, was now scribbling furiously in her notebook, her eyes wide. The stagehand, who'd smirked at Karoline's youth, was clapping now, his hands moving almost involuntarily, and others in the crew joined him, their applause a slow, steady rhythm. Mia, the soundboard operator, was nodding, her hands still on the controls, her earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet awe. Online, the reaction was explosive. Clips of Karoline's words spread like wildfire, the hashtag Karoline claps back trending globally. A tweet from a prominent commentator read, "She's not just a press secretary. She's a force, somewhere in a quiet office." Michelle Obama watched the broadcast on a tablet, her face unreadable. She set the device down and dialed a number, her voice low and trembling as she spoke to a trusted advisor. "How did we miss this?" she asked, the question heavy with disbelief. Back in the studio, Karoline lowered the report, her hands steady, her expression calm but resolute. "This isn't an attack," she said, her voice cutting through the growing applause. "It's a reminder. Policies are complex, and truth doesn't bend to fit anyone's story, not mine, not Mrs. Obama's." The words were a declaration, not of victory, but of principle, and they resonated with a clarity that silenced even the skeptics in the room. The audience's applause grew louder, a wave that seemed to lift the studio's heavy air. Sarah Coleman was standing again, her claps sharp and deliberate, and more joined her, their hands a chorus of support. The stagehand, now red-faced, clapped harder, as if trying to make up for his earlier doubt. Mia's eyes were bright, her nod more pronounced, as if she'd found something to believe in. Harper, visibly rattled, tried to pivot. "This is significant," he stammered, glancing at his notes. "But let's talk about intent." The Obama administration, Karoline cut him off, her voice gentle but firm. "Intent matters," she said, "but so do results, and the results don't lie." The interruption was polite, but it was a checkmate, and Harper knew it. Online, the narrative was shifting. Posts praising Karoline's precision outnumbered the attacks. With one viral tweet reading Karoline Leavitt just schooled CNN, "This is what truth looks like." But there were still detractors, voices calling her ruthless, accusing her of twisting history. The weight of those words pressed against her. But she didn't let it show. She thought of her father, his quiet pride when she'd landed her first job in politics, and the pen in her pocket felt heavier, grounding her. She'd made her choice to speak, to risk everything, and the world was listening. The studio clock ticked down, its seconds loud in the charged silence. Karoline sat back, her folder still open, her eyes fixed on the camera. She'd laid her truth bare, and it was ringing out. But the echo was only beginning. The lights burned brighter, the cameras unyielding, and the audience's applause faded into a restless hum. Karoline's hands rested on the report, its pages a testament to her resolve. She'd turned the world's gaze. But something lingered, a question, a shadow, a final truth waiting to be spoken. The CNN studio, once a cauldron of tension, had softened into a quieter hum as the broadcast neared its end. The spotlights still burned, their glare casting long shadows across the polished black stage. But the air felt lighter, as if the storm Karoline Leavitt had unleashed had finally broken. She rose from her seat, her navy dress slightly creased from the intensity of the past hour, and stepped off the platform, her low heels clicking faintly against the floor. Her folder, now closed, was tucked under her arm, its pages a silent testament to the battle she'd fought. The audience, a mix of studio guests and millions online, was still processing her words, their applause from moments ago fading into a restless murmur. David Harper, the anchor, sat at the desk, his notes scattered, his earlier sharpness dulled by the weight of Karoline's evidence. Her father's pen, nestled in her pocket, felt warm against her fingertips, a steady reminder of why she'd come. As she reached the edge of the stage, a young production assistant, a woman with a clipboard and a nervous smile, hurried toward her. "Ms. Leavitt," she said, her voice soft but earnest. "You were incredible out there." She pressed a plastic cup of water into Karoline's hands, the cool surface a small relief against the heat of the moment. Karoline nodded, her lips curving into a tired smile, but her eyes glistened, a faint shimmer of unshed tears catching the light. The assistant's words, simple as they were, cracked something open inside her, a flood of relief, exhaustion, and a deep, aching connection to her father. He'd always told her, in his steady New Hampshire drawl, "You don't need to shout to be heard. Karoline, just stand your ground." She could almost hear him now, his voice a quiet anchor in the chaos of the studio. She moved toward the backstage hallway, a narrow corridor lined with cables and equipment, the noise of the studio fading behind her. The weight of the broadcast pressed against her chest, not just the facts she'd laid bare, but the years of being underestimated, dismissed as too young, too loyal, too small to matter. The anonymous message calling her a puppet still lingered in her mind, its sting sharp but no longer paralyzing. She'd answered it, not with anger, but with truth. And the world had noticed. Her phone, still on silent, buzzed faintly in her pocket, but she didn't check it. She knew social media was ablaze, clips of her citing the Obama-era deportation numbers circulating, the hashtag Karoline claps back trending worldwide. But right now, she didn't need the noise of the internet. She needed a moment to breathe. In the hallway, Sarah Coleman, the freelance journalist who'd clapped first, was waiting. Her notebook was tucked under her arm, her glasses pushed up into her gray hair. "Ms. Leavitt," she said, her voice warm but firm. "I've covered politics for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like that. You're the future of truth, The words hit Karoline like a wave, not because they were grand, but because they were sincere. She blinked, her throat tightening, and managed a quiet, "Thank you." Sarah's eyes softened, and she reached out, giving Karoline's arm a gentle squeeze before stepping back. The gesture was small, but it felt like a bridge, connecting Karoline to a world that was finally seeing her. Somewhere across the country, Michelle Obama sat in a quiet room, her tablet dark now. She'd watched the broadcast to its end, her fingers still on the phone she'd used to call her advisor. Minutes earlier, she'd posted a tweet. "Brief but pointed policy is complex, and I regret any oversimplification. Let's keep talking." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, a crack in the armor of her narrative. Online, the post sparked a frenzy, with some praising her grace and others calling it too little. Too late. Karoline hadn't seen it yet. And when she did, she wouldn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth had spoken, and it was enough. Back in the hallway, Karoline paused, leaning against a wall, the cup of water still in her hand. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver pen, its engraved word "Dad" catching the dim light. She ran her thumb over the letters, her eyes stinging as she remembered the man who'd given it to her. He'd been gone 3 years, but his lessons were etched into her bones. Stand tall. Speak clear. Let the truth do the rest. She'd done that today, not for applause or headlines, but because it was right. The tears came now, quiet and unbidden, sliding down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. They weren't weakness. They were release, a letting go of the weight she'd carried into that studio. Mia, the soundboard operator, appeared at the end of the hallway, her headset dangling around her neck. She'd been one of the skeptics, her eyes once dismissive in the waiting room. Now, she approached slowly, her expression soft. "I was wrong about you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't just win out there. You changed something." Karoline looked at her, the tears still wet on her face, and nodded. "I just did my job," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Mia smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips, and turned back toward the studio, leaving Karoline alone again. The hallway was quiet now, the distant hum of the studio a faint echo. Karoline slipped the pen back into her pocket, her fingers lingering on its warmth. She thought of her father, of the nights he'd spent teaching her to question, to dig, to fight with facts instead of fury. She'd honored him today, not by shouting, but by standing firm. And that was when the truth didn't need to shout anymore. Honor, she realized, wasn't loud. It was the quiet strength to do what was right, even when the world doubted you. She straightened, her tears drying, and took a sip of the water, its coolness grounding her. The fight was over, but its echoes were just beginning. The White House press office was a small, cluttered space, its walls lined with framed photos of past briefings and a whiteboard scrawled with talking points. Karoline Leavitt sat at her desk, a simple wooden table tucked in the corner, her navy blazer draped over the back of her chair. The late afternoon sun filtered through a narrow window, casting a soft glow across the room, illuminating a stack of papers and a single silver pen resting beside her laptop. The pen, engraved with "Dad," was a quiet companion, its presence a reminder of the man who'd shaped her and the fight she'd waged just days ago. The hum of the office was subdued, the usual flurry of phone calls and footsteps softened by the end of the workday. Karoline's phone lay face down, its notifications silenced, but she knew the world outside was still buzzing with the aftermath of her CNN appearance. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the edge of a newspaper, the Washington Post, open to an op-ed that had run that morning. The headline read Karoline Leavitt and the Power of Truth. The writer, a veteran columnist, had described her as more than a press secretary, calling her a reminder that facts can still cut through noise. The words were kind, but they felt heavy, like a mantle she wasn't sure she was ready to carry. She'd returned to work the day after the broadcast, slipping back into a routine of drafting statements and fielding questions. But something had changed. Colleagues who once nodded politely now stopped to shake her hand, their smiles genuine. A senior aide had even left a handwritten note on her desk. "You did us proud." Yet Karoline felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction, tempered by the weight of what it had cost to stand up. The broadcast had rippled far beyond the studio. CNN had re-aired clips, and this time, the audience's applause was longer, warmer, as if they'd seen something worth celebrating. Social media, once a battleground of scorn and support, had settled into a softer rhythm. Posts called her the silent hero and the voice we didn't expect, though some still criticized her, accusing her of grandstanding. The hashtag Karoline Claps Back lingered in trending lists, but Karoline hadn't checked it. She didn't need to. The truth had done its work, and that was enough. She thought of Michelle Obama's tweet, the brief acknowledgement that had stunned the internet. It hadn't been an apology, but it was a step, a crack in the narrative that had painted Karoline's side as heartless. She hadn't responded, and she wouldn't. The fight wasn't about winning. It was about clarity. A knock at the door broke her reverie. A young intern, barely 20, poked his head in, holding a stack of mail. "Miss Leavitt, these came for you," he said, his voice tinged with awe. He set the letters on her desk, a mix of envelopes from supporters and a few from critics, their handwriting sharp and angry. Karoline thanked him, her smile polite but distant, and he lingered a moment, as if wanting to say more. "I saw you on CNN," he blurted finally. It made me want to do better." He ducked out before she could reply, leaving her alone with the weight of his words. She opened one letter, from a retired teacher in Ohio. "You reminded me that truth still matters. Thank you." The handwriting was shaky, but the sentiment was steady, and Karoline's throat tightened as she set it down. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the White House lawn, its grass clipped neat under the fading light. Offers had come in since the broadcast, consulting roles from conservative think tanks, speaking engagements, even a tentative inquiry from a senator's campaign. She'd turned them all down, choosing to stay where she was, in the press office, where the work was hard but honest. She wasn't here for fame or power. She was here to do what her father had taught her, to carry the truth, no matter how heavy. The pen on her desk caught her eye, and she picked it up, running her thumb over the engraving. She smiled, a small, private curve of her lips, and set it back down, its weight grounding her as always. The office was quiet now, the last of her colleagues gone for the day. Karoline sat back at her desk, opening her laptop to draft a statement for the next briefing. The Washington Post article lay beside her, its words a faint echo of the storm she'd weathered. She thought of the stagehand who'd doubted her, the journalist who'd clapped, the intern who'd looked at her with hope. She thought of her father, his voice a constant in her mind. "Stand tall, Karoline. The truth will stand with you." She'd done that, not with shouts or theatrics, but with the quiet strength of facts. And in doing so, she'd changed something not just for herself, but for those watching, those who'd felt dismissed, unseen, unheard. The sun dipped lower, painting the room in hues of gold and shadow. Karoline's fingers paused on the keyboard, her eyes drifting to the pen once more. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She realized she only needed to stand still and let the truth ring out. The world had listened, and its echo would linger, a reminder that honor wasn't in the noise, but in the courage to speak when it mattered most. She turned back to her work, the soft click of her typing filling the silence, a steady rhythm carrying her forward. Karoline's pen rested on the desk, its faint gleam catching the last light of day. The office was still, but her quiet resolve seemed to hum in the air. No cheers, no banners, just a truth that stood tall. Could one voice, steady and soft, really shift a world so loud? Sometimes, the deepest justice isn't in the noise, but in the courage to speak when no one expects you to.